step number 24, right? So we are stitching the undersleeve to the upper sleeve, right? And we're actually doing it at the front, the one that goes to the front seam. So that way we can finish the back seam where the button goes. So we've stitched it together from top to bottom. You are easing between the dots. There's a little bit of ease there for the elbow, right, to allow for elbow movement. So just a tiny bit. It's nothing too extraordinary. And then, of course, we put on the bottom facing. So the facings for the miter, they are fitted to the front and back. So make sure you cut out, right, opposite, flip the pattern so you get both sides. So after you fit it on, right, you've created one right and one left sleeve. You're basically taking this angled edge and you're literally just folding it in on itself, right, from top to bottom. And then we'll check the guide sheet. I don't think it's a 5/8 inch seam allowance. There is a point on the guide sheet where it tells you to miter, and there is a miter underneath the sewing directions. So, but it's literally taking the bottom edge to the side edge, right, and stitching. And the fold line's probably here. And then clearly when that's stitched and trimmed, you're going to turn it to the outside and have a finished edge with which you can create a buttonhole and a button in there. Okay, so again, it seems like a little wide, but it is at the 5/8 inch seam line. And after you've done that, you're going to want to create that point, right, on the inner edge and trim them. Actually, they don't need to be two different lengths, so that way it can turn easier. And if you want to actually iron it first and then trim it, it'll be even easier to turn inside out and get a nice, oops, there we go, a nice mitered edge. And the best part is the side I didn't trim. It'll end up looking like this. The best part is you already have your seam line then there, right? And here you also end up having those seam lines here. After everything is nicely pressed into place, right, you'll end up noticing that one side has a little bit more seam allowance and the other side has 0 seam allowance. It's at this point that if you would like to, or if you haven't already covered, right, your side edges with bias tape, now's a good time, or serge it off. You're going to find that large dot in here on either side, and it looks like I might have put it on, and match them up, and it looks like it's going to be at the 5/8 inch seam allowance mark, which makes sense. 5/8 inch seam allowance mark. So if all else fails, match up the seam allowances, because that's where the large dart is. And you're going to go ahead and stitch from between the large dot and the very top of the sleeve. And I don't think there's ease in here. Yeah, so it should be fairly easy, just a straight stitch. After you press it out, right, you stitch between the dots. Here at the bottom, you'll notice, again, it's a little uneven. So this is where, and it'll kind of naturally roll towards, or at least it should, one underneath the other. But in order to keep these seam allowances pressed open, we can just go ahead and snip, right? So they just continue this line, snip. And we're also going to end up stitching this down. I think it tells you in your guide sheet from the fold line right, to the large dot on the 5/8 inch. And this is just going to keep these both closed and together and all going in the same direction, right? But at the same time, if you want to go ahead and put in your button first, right? I think it's a little bit further down, or excuse me, the buttonhole. Go ahead and do that before you stitch all this down, because it's just easier to get in there. It's not impossible, but it is a little bit easier. So, and then of course, when it's all done, you're going to turn it all to the inside out, and over top of that buttonhole, you're going to end up just sewing the button through all the layers, and that's what's going to keep all of this together. But it'll also look like, right, it's separate when it's actually all sewn together. So I also noticed that one side's a tinge longer than the other, and that is easily fixable in that you just pull the sides so that they meet, right? After you put in your buttonhole and button, make sure these sides are flush. And depending on how it looks on the outside, you can just release this a little bit and work up any excess into the sleeve itself, right? So I would end up taking this apart and then maybe to here and then reworking it in. Otherwise, if I turn it to the outside, it may not even show. But the key is, actually it does create a little bit of a pucker. So there's that pucker again, but I would just release this up into here. This is going to be, right, overlapping. So, yeah. And again, the button sewing through the entire thing will keep it all together. All right, so in order to set in the sleeve, right, now that we have it all together, we are going to do a double line of basting between the large dots, right? Between the large dots, 2 sets of basting, because there's going to be ease on the upper cap of the sleeve. On the jacket itself, right, we're just sewing front to back, and it will be between, or from the large dot here on the vent, which again, the vents you'll end up on the bottom, you're going to be creating a miter very similar to what we did on the sleeve, right? So after you interface, miter the bottom, so that way you can do the hem separately. But also, before you set in the sleeve, you'll just need to stitch from the large dot to the armhole, right? And it looks a little squared off here, but it's at the 5/8 inch line. So after you stitch, it'll be a nice curve to the armhole opening. All right, setting in the sleeve, I have my sleeve turned inside out to the right side, and I have my jacket on the right half, right? Because I'm doing the right sleeve. I have the jacket turned out inside out because in order to do right sides together, right, this kind of works out better. And again, there's more than one way. I like personally starting at the top dot, right, that matches to the shoulder seam, right? So we'll anchor that in place first. And then I end up matching the large dots, in which case one side, meaning the sleeve, is larger than the armscye. And whichever way you're pinning, stay on that side of the fabric, because then that means that you'll be sewing from that side. So again, we have excess here. I'm just pulling these top 2 rows of basting and leaving my bottom free. Right, because if you start pulling on both sides, it'll end up knotting up the basting, which won't allow you to pull up any shirring, right? So the same thing here, I'm going to match up the other side's large dots, and I think I went beyond the large dot a little bit, but that is fine. Oh no, here we go. Large dot, right? And I'll go ahead and pin again. I did go a little bit beyond, but that's fine. I'm still just gathering between the large dots. So I'll start doing that. And again, I'm only pulling on this side. I'm not going to start pulling the threads on the underside because again, that'll make it. Okay, so it's about that much ease. And then I'm going to come down to the, not the side seam, but the dart, right, that goes into the pocket. Since we don't have a side seam on the jacket, this technically would match up, right, to the dot on the bottom of the sleeve, right? I think there's a dot. Yes. So this would be the very bottom, right? The centered bottom edge. And then I'll just, go ahead and pin around. These should match up fairly easily. And again, I should start pinning right on the inside, just because when I sew, you want your pins all in the same direction. Pin it so that any excess seam allowance, right, is open. So I'll pin so this stays down while I'm stitching. And again, if all of my pin heads are in the same direction, they're easy to pull out while I'm sewing. And I will do that same exact process to the front side. And then we'll be ready to go ahead and take it to the machine and sew it in for real. So it's all stitched in, and you can see there's minimal gathers, right? It's just ease. If I take it to the outside, right, we'll end up pressing this out. We'll press all the, actually we're going to press the seam allowances toward the sleeve, right? And all of these little tucks will flatten out, right? It's just I haven't pressed it yet. But also, after pressing it, if your fabric is thicker, you can also grade down the seams. You may also have to snip here at the underarm if you feel like it needs to splay a little bit more. But try on the jacket first. If the fabric is thin enough, you may not have to do that. One more thing is the header, right? We ended up cutting out of felt an inch beyond, right, the dots. So between the dots was around 8 inches. So I added an inch on either side, 10. I'm going to find the center of it, and I'm going to place it at the shoulder seam. So if you just align these edges, right, to the header, we're going to end up just stitching about 1/2 inch in. So before, you don't want to stitch beyond our stitch line. If you even want to do it a little bit closer to the raw edge, that's fine. As long as you don't go beyond that 5/8 inch. Since this is a 1/2 inch wide, or excuse me, 1 inch wide, and 1/2 inch would be optimal, because as we stitch it into the sleeve, this is going to fold over and create a crisper edge. All right, this is what the header looks like, right? We avoided the stitch line there, right? That is, our stitch line for the sleeve to the jacket, body, and of course, when it is turned, right, to the outside and pressed nicely, all of this will create a nice, sharper edge. Okay.